Awareness of his mission. Although Jesus was certain from the age of 10 that he was destined to carry out a great mission on earth, it was in his 15th year that he gained clarity about this. Earlier in that year, Jesus formulated the prayer he later taught to his apostles, which millions of Christians worldwide know as the Lord's Prayer. The family knew many forms of thanksgiving and several set prayers. After his father's death, Jesus tried to teach the older children to express themselves individually in prayer. But they could not follow his train of thought and kept falling back on their memorized prayers. In these attempts to encourage his oldest brothers to individual prayer, Jesus tried to get them started by using suggestive phrases. But shortly thereafter, and without Jesus intending it that way, it happened that they all used a form of prayer largely composed of these suggestive lines Jesus had taught them. Finally, Jesus abandoned the idea of having each member of the family put spontaneous prayers into words. One evening in October, he seated himself by the flat oil lamp that stood on the low stone table, and on a smooth cedar plank, with a piece of charcoal. He wrote down the prayer that from then on became the regular family prayer. Around that time, his youngest sister Ruth was born. Jesus tried as best he could to take his father's place in comforting and helping his mother during the weeks surrounding childbirth. By now, he had very thoroughly reviewed many matters related to his imminent spiritual work for the world, and he made up his mind about them. But he said nothing about them to his mother, who still held tensely stuck to the idea that he was the Jewish Messiah. Jesus went through periods of deep contemplation that year. His frequent trips through the hills to pray, and the many strange ideas, deeply troubled his mother. Sometimes she thought the boy was beside himself, but then she calmed her fears again by remembering that he was, after all, a child of promise. Meanwhile, Jesus had learned not to express all his thoughts, even to his own mother. Jesus talked less and less about what was going on in his consciousness. That is, he spoke less about things that the average person could not grasp and that would cause him to be considered peculiar. By all appearances, he became ordinary and conventional. Inside, this young man was lonely, and he strongly longed for someone who could understand his problems. He fervently longed for a trusted friend, but his problems were too complicated for those with whom he interacted to understand. The uniqueness of the unusual situation forced him to carry his burden alone. He had thoroughly considered the idea of the Jewish Messiah and had become firmly convinced that he would not be that Messiah. He longed to help his father's people, yet he in no way expected that he would ever lead Jewish armies to overthrow the foreign domination of Palestine. He knew he would never sit on the throne of David in Jerusalem. Nor did he believe that his mission would consist of being a spiritual liberator exclusively for the Jewish people. Therefore, his life's mission could in no way be the fulfillment of the intense Jewish desire from messianic prophecies, at least not as the Jews understood these prophets. Similarly, he was certain that he would never act as the Son of Man as described by the prophet Daniel. From his earliest years, he felt the poverty among men due to their lack of commitment to the fatherly love of God. His divine nature slowly unfolded, and already at this youthful age his human mind realized that his task here on earth would be to show man the way to the loving heart of the Heavenly Father. When he thought of the near future, he felt the responsibility for his family, but deep inside he knew that his real task would come after that. In his search for truth, Jesus studied many scrolls from the synagogue library. One evening Jesus found a scroll there called the Book of Enoch. The text fascinated him greatly, and he read and reread it. There was one section that particularly impressed him, a paragraph in which the phrase, Son of Man, appeared. The author of this so-called Book of Hebrews went on to tell of this Son of Man and the work he would perform on earth, explaining that before he came down to earth to bring salvation to mankind, this Son of Man had walked through the courts of heavenly glory with his Father, the Father of all, and that he had turned his back on all this grandeur and glory to descend to earth to proclaim salvation to needy mortals. As Jesus read these paragraphs, they resonated in his heart, and he recognized that of all the messianic prophecies in the Hebrew Scriptures and of all the theories concerning the Jewish deliverer, none came as close to the truth as this story tucked away in this only partially credible book of Hebrews. On the spot, he then decided to assume the title, Son of Man, at the beginning of his work. And indeed he did so when he began his work in public. Jesus had an infallible ability to recognize truth, and he never hesitated to take in truth, regardless of what source it seemed to come from.